Users of Reddit, what was the most disturbing thing you saw in person? ER nurse, trauma code on a middle-aged gentleman who wrecked his car, basically dead on arrival and didn't make it. The ambulance that dropped him off had to do a speed clean of the bloody gurney to rush out to another call immediately. 30 minutes later it brings in an old lady who had fallen at home. She kept saying she can't get a hold of her son and he was supposed to take her to the hospital. Turns out her son was the one who wrecked his car on his way to take his mom to the hospital, and she was brought in on the same gurney that her dead son was just laying on moments earlier. That was a gut punch having to tell her the bad news. This was in a rural community with limited ambulance service. I saw a guy's leg shredded by a recycling truck that didn't see him. It was something out of a human anatomy textbook. You could see every muscle and bone from thigh to shin. The poor dude was still alive in extreme pain. As the ambulance came to get him, he looked so pale and cold. I found out he died shortly after. This reminds me of when I started bleeding out after a surgery. It was freezing, but also weirdly not, since I could tell that the ambient temperature was warm but I was so cold. My lips legit turned blue, which I didn't realize was actually possible unless you were dead already. Very weird experience. When I was about 9 years old, our family was staying at a campground on a river in northern Michigan. A 2-year-old boy had wandered off and was missing. The entire park was looking for him. After about 2 hours with no luck, some of us began looking in the water at the ends of the docks nearby. When I dove down in about 4 of water, I found him floating just off the bottom of the river. I pulled him to the surface and shouted for help. The EMTs made an effort to resuscitate him. To no avail. As horrible as that was, the thing that I will never forget was the sound his mother made when I carried him ashore. I still enjoy boating and swimming, but I have a very healthy respect for the water. On Easter Sunday about 10 to 12 years ago, I saw a young teenage boy get hit by a car while riding his bicycle. I watched the life leave his eyes as I stood over him, but that was nothing compared to the sound his mother made when she arrived on the scene, which still haunts me to this day. I used to work with trauma survivors. I heard every horror known to man. Have heard several mothers the moment they were told their child died. Nothing has ever haunted me so much as the little 7/8 of a year-old girl screaming for her daddy at the scene of a rollover once. Hit by a drunkard and dad wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Bounced all over and his neck did a complete 270. Entering a friend's place for the first time without prior knowledge that he was / is a hoarder at age 40. Total shock. Dude has normal job, friends etc., but an absolute hoarder. Dead mice in the flat, trash in the kitchen reaching almost to the ceiling, mold everywhere on one wall of the bedroom. I didn't dare to use the bathroom. Utter shock. I had a hoarder friend. I was shocked. She asked for help cleaning for her kids and it was filth everywhere. I thought she meant help fold clothes. I lived with a friend that was a bit of an animal hoarder. She worked in a vet clinic, was a licensed animal rehabber and chairperson of a wildlife sanctuary. There were creatures and cages everywhere, everything from otters to raccoons running around the house because some were too disabled to be released into the wild, so they turned into pets. It was a 24-hour job keeping all the cages clean, and it was so overwhelming. Animal rescue is very emotionally painful. She and I and many other rehabbers I've known had issues with alcohol and painkillers. An elderly man on a bike get hit by a truck. I had to hold his head together with my shirt to try and stop the bleeding until the ambulance came. I was waiting at a bus stop, and on the other side of the rather tall divider were 3 bikers waiting for the light behind a bus, at a major intersection. Moments later, another bus came up behind, but realized too late it had no brakes. Several people injured, but 2 of the 3 bikers were squished to pulp. One was thrown to the pavement on the far side of the road, and survived with injuries. I never dared cross the road and look on the other side of that divider. It was in the papers the next morning. Nigeria. I was walking through a busy market when I spotted a man having an altercation with the driver of a semi-truck. He got agitated and propped himself up on the truck's tire to try and reach the window. Driver started the engine and made to drive off, and as the wheel turned, the angry man slipped and fell so that his head was perfectly lined up with the tire he'd just been standing on. There was a sickening crack a second later as the truck rolled over his head and killed him. Here 1 minute, gone the next. A woman I semi-know was walking with her son down the busy centre of London. She wanted to pass some people and passed them from the left. She misstepped and fell on the street, and 1 second later a bus drove right over her head. Like what the? Now I keep at least 1 m from the sidewalk. I was no contact with my abusive addict mom for many years. She passed in 2020, a sheriff's deputy found her during a wellness check. It was declared that she had been dead for a couple of weeks in July heat with no utilities. My father and I drove to her house the day after they removed her body. You could smell the decomposition from a block away. She had cancelled trash services and had 3+ years of garbage bags piled to the ceiling in her garage. There were rats running all over the house. 99.9% of our family pictures were peeled or eaten by rats and not salvageable. Both of her toilets were out of order and full to the brim with crap. Everything I saw in her house was absolute nightmare fuel. My dad died alone in the camper he was living in when he bled out from his alcoholism. I didn't find the body, my brother did, but my sister and I helped him clean the camper so he could sell it. I think I've blocked the memory of the smell. It was summer and we don't know how long he laid there, but I remember blood spattered everywhere like a horror movie, and empty jug after empty jug that had held cheap vodka. I remember tossing the cushion he laid on as unsalvageable, but can't recall exactly what it looked like. I appreciate that my brain is protecting me from a lot of the details. Sorry to piggyback on your comment, but this reminded me of my dad. I'm super sorry about your mom. Even someone you're no contact with or you've lost all love for, it's not easy seeing them that way. I hope you've gotten lots of opportunity to process and work through things. Please like and subscribe for daily content. I love you. Around the age of 5 I was living with my family on my grandfather's farm. One day while my father was working I was home alone with my mother. She went to take a bath while I was watching TV. After my show ended I realized she wasn't anywhere in the living room, kitchen, or master bedroom. It was a trailer home so not big. I went to check the only bathroom and she was completely submerged underneath the bath water from having a seizure. I ran to go get my grandfather and called 911 like I was taught as he tried to revive her via CPR. The paramedics eventually arrive and are able to revive her, but only for a brief period before her heart gives out again and they pronounce her dead. TLDR, I found my mother's corpse when I was 5. Edit, didn't exactly think this would blow up this much. Thank you for all the kind words. I'm 30 now so I've had more than enough time to cope. Dang, I'm so sorry for your loss, that sounds so awful. I found my mother's corpse when I was 10. Went to ask her if I could have corn dogs for breakfast and she wasn't responding to me, so I shook her arm and her skin was ice cold, so I turned off her fan and yelled for my older brother to wake mom up. She never did. She died in her sleep from blood toxicity. All the prescribed pills she was taking added up to a toxic level. Probably not that disturbing in comparison to others. But when you work as a vet tech you see a lot of horrific things that stick with you. 2 instances that stick out the most to me was a Labrador that had been degloved from the waist down after being hit by a car, open fractures on both her hind legs. We tried to save her but she was already gone by the time she arrived. Then it was witnessing the owner's grief at such a traumatic event and losing his beloved pooch. Second was a kitten that had been smacked against a wall by its hind leg and then thrown over a balcony. He survived the fall but the hind leg had essentially disintegrated. It was broken so severely and had to be amputated. What was more freaked up was the owner tried to claim the kitten back so he could put it out of its misery. Humanity at its finest. The only thing that keeps me going working in this field is helping the poor animals. Sometimes I feel like it has killed my empathy towards humans. I had one cat come in for an appointment. I walked in the room, he was lethargic. Some to find out he was blocked for God knows how long. He also had a severe heart condition. The doctor hooked him up to a neck and did a risky cysto. His urine was pure blood. The cat ended up seizing in my arms, flatlined and went limp. My co-worker and I just stared at each other in disbelief for a second. She turned and grabbed the crash kit. He suddenly woke up. Like nothing happened. Just like, hey guys, what happened? The owners were refusing to take him to an emergency vet for further care. In a general practice we don't have the tools for something like this. After the doctor's multiple failed attempts to convince them, I went out there with a 6 ml syringe full of bloody urine and showed them. The look of horror on their face told me they were going. They did. I didn't care about their feelings at that point. Someone had to speak for that poor boy. Cat is still alive. Same day, a dog came in for his exam. He had a grade 4 heart murmur. Dog got super excited, screamed and just died. We did CPR but nothing. The screams from the owner and the scream from the dog before he passed will always be stuck in my head. This owner did anything and everything for her dog. Broke my heart. Motorcycle T-boned a vehicle immediately after a hurricane in Florida. Blew through a four-way stop going way too fast, flew over the car and went face first into the asphalt. Headless body continued about another 40 or 50 feet. In Dayton, Ohio around 2015 went to an air show where the big attraction was the wing walker. You stand on top of a plane as it does tricks. The announcer was really hyping up the woman as she performed, talked about how she was a wing walker as a hobby and her children were here in the stands watching, etc etc. Plane went down for its final trick, a corkscrew that leaves the plane upside down a few hundred feet above the ground. Corkscrew was successful and the plane was upside down. Pilot lost control and immediately nose-dove into the dirt. Was close enough to the plane to watch her get torn to pieces seconds before the plane exploded. There's actual photos online of the incident and of her getting torn apart. Absolutely terrible. I think about her children from time to time. Hope they're okay. When I was 17 my father died after being in a coma for a week. I went to see him after he passed, but while he was still in his hospital room, he had a piece of plastic in his mouth, probably from a breathing tube or something. I had my little sister with me, who was 14 at the time. While we were stood there, staring at our father's body, a nurse came in to remove the plastic from his mouth. She then tried to close his mouth, but couldn't. So it just stayed open. My sister completely lost it. I was crying and just ended up kissing his forehead then leaving. It may not sound that bad, but it was an absolutely horrific moment for two teenage girls. I am so sorry. My so's mom passed really tragically early in 2022 and the thing that has stuck with me the most was seeing the tube still down her throat after she had died. I had to stop myself from pulling it out. Something about that freaking tube being there really messed me up too, and I was a whole grown woman. Hope you are both doing okay after that. Around 2 months ago my older neighbors came back from holiday. Long story short, the older gentleman came back with multiple infections including COVID. They both asked me to help and support them with a few manually demanding jobs, which of course is totally fine. A few days after they arrived home I got a phone call from his wife as she was concerned about her husband's condition. I went upstairs and he was blue and shaking. The shaking stopped and his chest dropped and didn't raise again. Straight onto CPR and an ambulance. Took them less than 10 minutes to get to us. I'm happy as freak to be able to say he came home just a few days ago, but watching someone go is definitely my scariest experience. When I was around 8 to 9 I saw a woman jump to her death from a bridge. We stayed and waited for the rescue team to come and pull her out of the water. They managed to find her despite the strong currents. I remember seeing her being carried by one of the emergency crew. He was yelling stuff about how her lungs had been punctured. People rarely survive that jump. It happens a lot in my hometown, sadly. At the time I wasn't really super horrified. I knew what happened, and to this day I remember every second of the whole ordeal. I remember her clothes. I remember seeing her on a bench under the bridge as we walked to the park where we'd later see her jump. I remember thinking that she looked sad and that maybe it would be nice if someone talked to her. I feel guilty for not having done anything to help her. When I lived in San Francisco, I always tried to pay attention to other people around me anytime I was at the Golden Gate Bridge because of how common suicides are there. Thankfully never saw anyone jump, but it gave the bridge an eerie and unsettling vibe knowing how often people chose it as their destination for suicide. When I was in Navy boot camp years ago, while I was on watch one night, some guy from the third floor decided to swallow a double-edged razor blade, then do a swan dive from the third floor balcony onto the pavement. The pavement smashed his skull and left bits of him all over the pavement. Then, about 20 years later, I was working as an off-road truck driver in the oil fields when last one night, I came across some tail lights in the road ahead of me when I noticed that the two red tail lights were both on the same side of the road, and the two amber running lights were both on the other side of the road. Then I saw the shadow of the truck lying on its side. I got out, and saw somebody sitting on the ground in the middle of the road, highlighted by his truck's headlights. I walked up and asked, "Are you alright, buddy?" There was no answer. Then I looked at his face and saw one eyeball hanging down on his cheek. Then I noticed the smashed-in hole in the side of his scalp. This was out in the New Mexican desert on a 4WD road, so it took over an hour to get help out there. He survived long enough for them to get there, but he died in a hospital a few hours later. That was tough. Gosh, he was still alive? I honestly can't think of any worse torture than sitting for hours with those kind of injuries. Whether he was feeling the pain or not, that must have been horrible. And horrible for you to have to see that too. My own mother being attacked by a dog while holding the cat I had grown up with. Our neighbors raced greyhounds and our cat was sunbaking outside on the veranda. One of their greyhounds had escaped the pen they were housed in and wasn't wearing a muzzle. Unfortunately, our cat was the first live thing the dog spotted at the same time my mother walked out the front door. She tried quickly grabbing the cat, but by the time she had gotten to him the dog had reached our veranda, knocking my mother off onto the ground a few feet down and began to fight for both of their lives. Luckily I was home at the time as well as my father, who was asleep after a long night at work. I heard her screams for help, ran outside to the scene and was stunned for a few moments before screaming for my father, who raced outside to try separating the dog from them both, who had by this time ripped shreds into my mother's arms and dislocated our cat's hip, but luckily both were alive. A ranger and ambulance was called, and then a few days later police attended, although when they approached our neighbors to locate the dog they had hidden it away on another property, which was eventually located. To this day, years on, they have never approached any of us to apologize. My neighbors did the same when their husky killed a stray cat I was feeding on my property, and attacked me when I tried to drive it off. My leg was left with big gashes, and I put the dog's eye out accidentally while defending myself with a stick I grabbed. The neighbors whisked the dog away somewhere, tried to sue me over its eye, and have never apologized. Years later, they now have an uncontrollable Rottweiler that almost rushed my terrier the other day because these morons don't lock their yard up right. It'll kill someone eventually. I remember working as a security guard for a hospital. I watched Certificate of Need patients. These were patients from our local asylum who were completely out of their mind. I did my third shift ever for that company, watching a guy who had picked up some pencils and stabbed a worker with it a couple times before turning a fresh one on himself and stabbing his own stomach 6 times. I took the third shift 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. All I did was sit in the hallway outside his door in a mostly dead wing of the ICU. I maybe saw one person an hour. It was just me in a chair in the middle of a dead hallway for 12 hours of the night. I'm freshly 18 at this point and had little experience with anything like this. I made it to about 3 a.m. before passing out in my chair outside his door. I was awoken by the guy I was watching himself. He had broken his own wrist to slip out of the handcuffs keeping him on the bed. He ripped his catheter and IV out. He tapped me on my shoulder to wake me up. I turned and looked at this man who was completely naked and bleeding from 2 places, holding his wrist, and he just said, "I need to pee." I decided to try and play it off like everything was normal as to not escalate the situation. I walked him to the bathroom and immediately called my CO while he was inside. My CO got there before he got out and we used restraints to put him back on the bed. Nurses came back in and set him back up. My CO, not knowing that I fell asleep, said I did the right thing and that I'd do great at the job. He said he needed more people like me who didn't panic in situations like that and make things worse. I thanked him and then left at 7 a.m. I never came back to do another shift for that security company. I'm so lucky he didn't use his IV to stab me in the neck while I was sleeping. And 4 is actually just a small plastic tube inserted into the vein with a syringe. You pull out the syringe and discard it. Hope it eases your mind a bit.